The letter was folded in thirds and sealed with dark red wax, and in 8 months of correspondence, Caleb Marsh had never once mentioned it. Ruth Calloway did not know what was inside it. She had not opened it, had not held it to the light, had not so much as pressed a thumbnail along the edge of the seal. She had simply carried it. From the moment Thomas's brother Edmund pressed it into her hands on the front steps of the Lancaster house in April, until the morning the wagon train rolled out of St. Joseph, Missouri, and the Missouri River disappeared behind her like a door being shut. Edmund had said very little. Edmund never said very little. He was a man of pronounced opinions and considerable lung capacity, but that morning he had been quiet in a way that unsettled her more than any speech could have. He handed her the letter. He said, "Give this to Caleb Marsh when you arrive. Not before. Don't lose it." Then he stepped back from the wagon, and the look on his face was the look of a man saying goodbye to something he did not entirely expect to see again. Ruth had tried to ask him what was inside. He had shaken his head once and turned away. She had been thinking about the letter for 2,000 miles. Her name was Ruth Calloway. Ruth Marsh soon enough, or so the plan went. She was 34 years old, brown-haired, of medium height, and possessed of the particular kind of steadiness that people often mistook for the absence of feeling. She had been a wife for 9 years, a widow for 2. She had no children, a fact that still caught her sometimes in the middle of ordinary tasks, hanging the washing or setting 2 plates on the table out of habit before she remembered, and the grief of it had shaped her in ways she could not have explained to anyone who hadn't lived it. Thomas had died in February of 1859. Consumption. It had taken 8 months, and it had not been peaceful, whatever people said about consumption. Ruth had nursed him through all of it. She had held his hand at the end. She had been, by every measure she knew, a good wife. And when it was over, she had sat in the house in Lancaster for 6 months, watching the light change on the floorboards, trying to decide if she was the kind of woman who could begin again. The matrimonial agency had felt ridiculous, at first. She had told no one she'd written to them. She had felt foolish filling out the form. Age, station, temperament, qualities sought in a partner, as though a husband were something you could order from a catalog. But the agency had written back within a week with 3 names, and Caleb Marsh of Oregon City had been the 3rd one. His first letter arrived in June of 1860. It was 2 pages, written in a careful, deliberate hand, and it said almost nothing that she expected. He did not describe himself in flattering terms. He did not make promises. He said he was 41 years old, that he had a farmstead outside Oregon City with 160 acres under his name, that he had never been married, and that he had decided he was too old to be romantic about the idea of a wife, and would she prefer honesty to pleasantries. He said he had been told he was a difficult man to warm to, and that this was probably fair. He said he grew wheat, and in a good year the wheat came in well enough, and in a bad year it did not, and that was farming, and he had made his peace with it. Then, at the bottom of the page, after his signature, he had added one more line. "I am told you were a good wife to Thomas Calloway. I would like to deserve the same." She had read that line 6 times before she put the letter down. She had written back the following Thursday. The wagon train left St. Joseph on the 14th of April, 1861, a Monday, the sky the pale washed-out blue of early spring. There were 23 wagons in Ruth's company, captained by a man named Harlan Seeks, who kept meticulous records and shouted more than was strictly necessary. Ruth had secured herself a spot in a wagon belonging to a family named Vows, husband, wife, 3 children under 10, in exchange for her help cooking and minding the younger 2 on the trail. It was a practical arrangement. She had no horse of her own, and the Vows needed hands. The Platte River Valley came into view around the 3rd week. She had expected the prairie to be beautiful, and it was, in its particular flat, relentless way, the grass stretching in every direction to a horizon that seemed to recede as you approached it, the sky enormous and indifferent above. But the beauty was the kind that didn't comfort you. It was the beauty of a thing that would exist long after you were gone, and it knew it. She walked most days. The wagon was too cramped for sitting, and the rocking made the youngest Vows child sick, and Ruth found that walking helped her think. She fell into step some mornings with a woman named Iris Beecham, who was traveling to meet a brother in the Willamette Valley, and had the kind of laugh that startled birds out of grass. Iris was 47 and had buried 2 children and 1 husband, and still managed to find the wagon train's cook, a taciturn man named Ordell, genuinely funny. Ruth found this impressive. She told Iris so. "Life's either going to be terrible or it's going to be fine," Iris said one morning. Somewhere west of Chimney Rock, the strange pale spire of it rising 400 feet from the Nebraska flats like something a child had left behind. And it's usually some of both, isn't it? You might as well find the funny parts. Ruth thought about that for several miles. Chimney Rock passed. Scott's Bluff came and went, its layered sandstone striped amber and cream and rust. They crossed into Wyoming territory in the middle of May, the trail narrowing between the bluffs, the days growing longer. Caleb's letters were in the case alongside the sealed one, all 8 months of their correspondence, folded and organized by date, because Ruth was not a woman who let important things become disordered. She read them sometimes in the evenings, by the light of the camp lantern, while the children slept and Iris sat nearby mending something. "Who are you writing to?" Iris asked once. And Ruth had explained about Caleb Marsh and the farm outside Oregon City and the 160 acres and the man who had said he was told he was difficult to warm to. "And are you worried about that?" Iris asked. "That he'll be difficult?" Ruth thought about it. "I was," she said, "at first. But his letters they're exact. He says what he means. There's nothing hidden in them." She paused. "I find that I trust a man who says he is difficult more than a man who says he is easy." Iris nodded as though this made considerable sense. "What's the letter?" she asked, and Ruth realized she was holding the sealed one without having meant to take it out. "Something to deliver," Ruth said, "from someone who knew him before." She did not say more, and Iris did not ask. This was one of the things Ruth had come to value about Iris Beecham. She understood that some things were not hers to require. Fort Laramie appeared on the 29th of May, a low cluster of buildings against the wide Wyoming sky, the smell of smoke and horses and 100 other wagon trains that had passed through before them. They stopped for 2 days. Ruth bought needles and thread and a small bottle of camphor and wrote a letter to Caleb that she would mail from the fort, the last letter she would send before arriving. She told him she was well. She told him the trail was longer in the feeling of it than she had expected. She told him she thought about the farm. She did not tell him about the sealed letter. She had decided somewhere back along the Platte that she would not mention it until she placed it in his hands. The second day at Fort Laramie, a man in their wagon train died. His name was Auguste DeVoe. Not the husband's father, 62 years old, who had seemed perfectly well at breakfast and was not well by dinner and was dead before midnight. Cholera. The word moved through the camp like smoke, low and fast, and by morning 3 families had separated their wagons from the rest and would not come back. Ruth sat with the DeVoe children while their parents tended to what needed tending to, and she held the youngest one, who was 4 and did not entirely understand what had happened and kept asking for his grandfather in the way that small children ask for things, with a simplicity that does not make room for the answer. She held him until he slept. She sat for a while afterward in the dark. She did not open the letter. South Pass came on the 14th of June, mile 947 by Harlan Sykes accounting, the highest point on the trail at 7,412 feet. The Continental Divide spread out beneath their feet like a threshold. The land on the other side of the pass was the same land, same sagebrush, same pale sky, but it felt different to cross it. Ruth stood for a moment at the top and looked west, toward a horizon she couldn't yet see the end of, and something inside her shifted in a way she couldn't name. She thought about Thomas. She had been thinking about him less than she expected. Not forgetting, she would not forget Thomas. She was not built for forgetting, but holding him more gently, the way you hold something precious that you finally accepted you must put down. She thought about the last good day, 4 days before the end, when he had been almost himself, and they had sat together by the window, and he had said, "You're going to be all right, Ruth." And she had said, "I know." And neither of them had meant it yet, but they'd said it as an act of will, the way you say a thing to make it true. She wondered if he had known about Caleb Marsh. She wondered if that was part of what was in the letter. She did not open it. Fort Bridger passed. Soda Springs. Fort Hall, where the Snake River began and the trail bent northwest into Idaho territory. The land drier now, the sagebrush low and silver gray, the sky a deeper blue than anything she had seen back east. They crossed the Snake River in late June at a ford that cost them half a day, and one of the DeVoe oxen, the animal simply lying down in mid-current and refusing to rise. Harlan Seek said something she didn't catch. Mrs. DeVoe pressed her lips together and said nothing. Ruth held the rope and pulled. July was the hard month. The Snake River plain was lava rock and alkali dust and heat that radiated upward from the ground as well as down from the sky. The water in the alkali springs made the livestock sick and the children irritable and the adults silent in the particular way of people who have run out of extra words. Ruth's hands cracked at the knuckles. Her boots wore through at the left heel. She ate less than she should have and said nothing about it. At night she took out the letters, Caleb's letters, and read them in order from the beginning. By now they were worn at the folds, soft as cloth. She could have recited most of them from memory. She particularly returned to one from September, 3 months into their correspondence, where he had said, "I have not always been a man who knew how to pay attention to the right things. I was told so by someone who knew me well, and I believe it was true. I am telling you this because I think you would find it out eventually, and I would rather you find it out from me." She had written back, "Attention can be learned. I've seen it happen." He had written back, "I intend to try." She did not know. Reading it again by lamplight with the coyotes calling somewhere out in the dark, whether he had meant it. She hoped he had. She found, somewhere in the miles since St. Joseph, that she wanted to know this man, not just to arrive safely, not just to have a home, but to know him. The letters had done something to her she hadn't expected. They had made her curious about the future, which was not a feeling she had expected to recover. She had not known, when she first read his letters, that Thomas's hand had been somewhere in them. She did not know that yet. The Blue Mountains arrived in August, dark and forested after the long bleach of the desert, the air smelling of pine and cold water and something green and living that she had almost forgotten existed. The trail wound up through switchbacks that required every ox, every rope, every able-bodied person in the wagon train. Ruth walked the steepest sections with her shoulder against the side of the wagon, pushing, her boots sliding on loose shale. She did not think about Thomas or Caleb or the sealed letter. She thought only about the next step, then the next one. They came down the eastern slope into the Grande Ronde Valley on a morning in mid-August, and Ruth sat down on a boulder beside the trail and did something she had not done in perhaps 100 miles. She breathed. The valley was green, impossibly green after the Snake River dust and the mountain rock. It was the greenest thing she had seen since Missouri, and it hit her somewhere in the chest in a way she hadn't anticipated. Iris appeared and sat beside her without a word, and they looked at the valley together for a long moment in silence. "Getting close now," Iris said finally. Ruth nodded. She was thinking about arriving. She had thought about arriving 100 times, but always in the abstract. The distance closing, the journey ending, Caleb Marsh waiting somewhere past the horizon. Now it was not abstract. It was real and near, and she was frightened in a way she had not let herself be frightened since Lancaster. "I don't know what he'll think," she said. Not explaining who. Iris knew. "Of you? Of me? Of this?" She gestured at herself, at the cracked hands and the worn-through boot and the trail dust that no amount of creek water had fully addressed. "I am not what I looked like in April." "No," Iris agreed. "You're more." Ruth looked at her. "You've earned all of that," Iris said, with a nod toward Ruth's worn and steady hands. "I don't know the man, but if he can't see that, then the problem is his eyesight." Ruth almost laughed. She would have, except that her throat was tight. She took out the sealed letter and looked at it. She had done this perhaps 40 times since St. Joseph. Held it, looked at it, put it back. The red wax was still intact. She had kept her word to Edmund, who had kept whatever word he'd made to someone else, and the letter had traveled 2,000 miles unopened, and in 3 days' time she would give it to the man whose name was written on the front. Caleb Marsh, Oregon City, Oregon. In Thomas's handwriting, she had noticed that the first day and had not let herself think too hard about it. Thomas had been dead 2 years, and the handwriting on the envelope was his, which meant he had written this before he died, had sealed it, had given it to Edmund, had said send this when she goes or something like it. And Edmund had waited. She did not know how Edmund had known about Caleb Marsh. She did not know what Thomas had said. She only knew that 2,000 miles ago she had made a promise not to open it. She put it back. The Dallas came and went. The last hard stretch, the Columbia River Gorge, steep and cold and magnificent. The river running fast and dark between basalt walls. The wagon train took the toll road rather than the river raft, and Harlan Sekas paid the toll with the air of a man who had weighed the alternative carefully. Ruth walked the road in an October rain, a thin, persistent rain, the kind that doesn't soak you but doesn't stop either, and she thought she had never in her life been this tired and also this awake. Oregon City appeared on the 4th of October, 1861. She could see it from the top of the last ridge, a real town, with a mill and a church steeple, and streets that someone had planned. The Willamette Valley spread out behind it, gold and green in the October light. For a moment she simply stood and looked. Then she started down. He was waiting at the edge of town. She saw him before he saw her, a tall man, lean, dark-haired, going to gray at the temples, standing beside a wagon with 2 horses. He was watching the direction of the approaching train but hadn't spotted her yet, and she had a moment to simply observe him. He stood still the way a person stands who is comfortable with waiting. He held his hat in his hands. His coat was clean. He had made an effort. She noticed that he had made an effort. She walked toward him, and he turned and saw her, and whatever she had expected his face to do, what it did was simply become more present. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they have been thinking about for a long time, trying to match the real against the imagined. "Ruth Calloway," he said. Not a question. Her name, said carefully. "Caleb Marsh," she said. He nodded. His eyes moved over her. Not unkindly, not appraisingly, but in the way of a man taking stock of what stood in front of him. "You're well?" he asked. "The crossing went well enough?" "Well enough," she said. There was a silence, not uncomfortable. 2 people who had been writing letters to each other for 8 months, standing 10 feet apart for the first time, both of them finding that language required more effort in person than on paper. Then Ruth reached into the lining of her traveling case and took out the sealed letter. "I was given this before I left Lancaster," she said. "I was told to give it to you when I arrived." Caleb looked at the letter. Something changed in his face. A slight stillness, a recognition, something passing through him the way weather passes through an open place. He reached out and took it from her. He looked at the handwriting on the front. He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas's hand," he said. "Yes." He looked at her then, and she saw that he had known Thomas Calloway. Not just known of him, but known him, and that whatever was in this letter was something he had been waiting for, or something he had feared, or possibly both at once, the way important things usually are. He did not open it there. He said, "Will you come and see the house?" She said, "Yes." She did not learn what was in the letter for 3 more days. She stayed those first days at the house of a woman named Clara Pruitt, the Methodist minister's wife, who opened her spare room without ceremony and fed Ruth a meal that involved 4 different vegetables from her own kitchen garden, and asked no questions that Ruth was not already willing to answer. Ruth slept 11 hours the first night. She did not dream. She had not slept that deeply since April. Caleb came each of those 3 days. He showed her the farm, the wheat fields in their October color, the barn he had built with 2 other men, the house he had framed himself from Douglas fir and finished with care. It was not a large house. It was a real one. She could see in the construction of it the evidence of someone who attended to detail, who thought about what would last. She found this significant. They talked carefully. He asked about the crossing, Not in the way of pleasantries, but in the way of a man who wanted to know what a thing had actually been. She told him about the DeVoes, about Auguste DeVoe dying at Fort Laramie, and the 3 families who separated their wagons the next morning and didn't come back. She told him about the Snake River Plain and the Blue Mountains and Iris Beecham's laugh that startled birds from grass. He listened without interruption. He asked 1 or 2 questions at the right moments. Specific questions, the kind that showed he had been paying attention. She did not ask about the letter. She had waited this long. On the 3rd evening, he came to the Prout house and asked if she would walk with him along the river, and she said yes, and they walked in the October dusk with the Willamette running quiet and dark beside them. About a quarter mile from town, he stopped and looked out at the water. "I knew Thomas from the war," he said. "Mexican campaign, 46, 47. He was 22, I was 26. We were in the same company for 7 months. He paused. "He was the finest man I knew." Ruth said nothing. She stood beside him and listened. "I lost track of him after we mustered out. You do sometimes. You come home and you find different things pulling in different directions. I came out here in 52. He wrote to me twice after. I wrote back. We were not close by then. Not like we'd been. But I knew he had married. I knew your name." He glanced at her briefly. "I heard, a few years ago, that he was ill. I wrote to him. He wrote back once, and then didn't write any more." He reached into his coat pocket and took out the letter. "I read it last night," he said. "I want to read it to you, if you'll let me." Ruth had carried the letter 2,000 miles without reading it. She had kept her promise to a man she hadn't understood. She looked at Caleb Marsh, who had written 8 months of letters in careful, honest sentences, who said he intended to try, who had cleaned his coat for her arrival, and she nodded. Caleb unfolded the letter. The paper was heavier than she'd expected, cream-colored, and Thomas's handwriting was there in ink that had not faded, and she recognized the hand the way you recognize a voice you thought you'd forgotten. Caleb read, "Caleb, I am writing this in November, and I may not see spring. Ruth does not know the full extent of it, or perhaps she does, and has decided not to say so, which would be exactly like her. I am writing to ask you a thing I have no right to ask. When she is ready to leave Lancaster, and she will leave eventually, she is not a woman built to stay still in a place that has become a grief. I would like her to know your name. I am going to arrange this without telling her I've arranged it. She would object to the arrangement, which is why she won't know. She is the best person I know. This is not grief talking. I have known it for most of our 9 years together, and I was not always good at saying so. She never required me to say it. She required very little. Don't mistake that for having few needs. She has needs like anyone. She simply will not name them, and she will not ask for help, and she will work herself past breaking before she admits she is struggling. Pay attention to the things she doesn't say. That is where she is. I don't know what you have become in all these years, Caleb. Your letters were good letters. I think you are a decent man. I think she will see that, and I think seeing it will matter to her. That is all I can ask. Take care of her the way I would have, if I'd had more time. She deserves someone who notices." Thomas, Caleb folded the letter. The river ran beside them in the dark, unhurried. Ruth did not speak for a long moment. She was thinking about November, 2 years past, Thomas at the desk by the window, the light thin and winter white, writing in that careful, deliberate hand. She had been in the other room. She had not known. He had sealed the letter and given it to Edmund and said, "Send this when she goes," and then he had come out of the study and sat beside her by the fire, and she had had no idea. "He arranged it," she said. It was not quite a question. "He arranged it," Caleb said. She thought about the matrimonial agency, the form she had filled out in secret, feeling foolish, telling no one. She thought about the letter that arrived in June from Caleb Marsh of Oregon City, who grew wheat and made his peace with a bad year and said he intended to try. She thought about all of it. 8 months of letters, careful and honest. Something in her quietly writing itself without her noticing, as though someone had been steadily adjusting a compass she hadn't known was off. Thomas had known. Thomas had looked at her across 9 years of marriage and seen the part of her that would not ask for what she needed, that would work in silence until she broke, that required something she would never name aloud, and he had named it for her, quietly, in a letter she never saw, addressed to a man he trusted with the one thing he could no longer protect himself. He said to pay attention to the things you don't say, Caleb said. His voice was level. He was looking at the water. I know, Ruth said. I heard. He looked at her. She looked at him. The dusk had settled fully now, the last light gone from the river, and she was 2,000 miles from everything she had known, and her hands were cracked from the trail, and her boot still had a hole in the left heel, and she was, for the first time in 2 years, not afraid of what came next. I'm cold, she said. I didn't say so earlier, but I am. He took his coat off and set it over her shoulders without ceremony, without comment, the way a man does a thing he has quietly decided he will simply do. They stood there a while longer, watching the river find its way in the dark. Oregon City found out what was in the letter on the 19th of October, 1861, at the Methodist Church on 3rd Street, when Caleb Marsh stood at the front of the room and read it aloud before he said his vows. Ruth had not asked him to. He had decided, as he seemed to decide most things, that it was simply what was right. She heard Thomas's words in Caleb's voice, in a room full of people she had known for 2 weeks, and she did not cry until the last line. She deserves someone who notices. She told herself later it was the relief of being off the trail. That was partially true, but only partially.